David Elder from Australia is a 2 times world Scrabble champion and is seen by many as the second best Scrabble player in the world. Here's a glimpse into the level that this guy plays on. When he was about to lose a game at the Australian Championships, he pretended to set up this winning play for about 80 points, and when his opponent wisely blocked the spot, Elder revealed his other plan, which was to extend my to Mayunural to win the game anyway. That's the kind of Scrabble this guy plays. It's not your typical living room player, and yet here is how Elder talks about the only player who's better than him.
It kind of defeats the purpose of the game for me, because I mean, my dream was to always be the best, but I tend to get stronger and stronger in the belief that he's completely untouchable, because he is not realistically beatable by a human.
Who is he talking about? Well, you can take a moment to imagine what the greatest Scrabble player of all time could look like. If you imagine someone whose visible dislike of being photographed is second only to his equally visible dislike of hairdressers, you nailed it. This is Nigel Richards from New Zealand, now living in Malaysia, and he's the protagonist of our video. And you might well be familiar with his face already, because I already did another long-form video on this walking dictionary, and world-class player Will Anderson has also been putting up fantastic recaps of Nigel's games. So why are we here again? Well, you saw it in the title. The walking dictionary has gone through a reprint. The latest edition now includes Spanish. So let's dive into how that happened. I still have my German accent, but I promise I will at least do less quonking than last time. You should quickly pause the video and read through Scrabble tournament rules if you're not familiar with them. That's really important, otherwise you'll hardly be able to follow. And with that, vamos. So let's quickly recap what you need to know going into this video. Nigel, first of all, is not a recent phenomenon in Scrabble. He started playing in the 90s and pretty much immediately emerged as an absolute unicorn of Scrabble brilliance. But in 2015, this reached a wider audience besides the very small niche of competitive Scrabble, when Nigel decided to really rub his extraterrestrialness under our noses by winning the French Scrabble World Championship without even speaking the language. And in my earlier video, I explained in depth how this is even possible and why it's somehow more impressive still than it seems at first glance. The gist of it was that Nigel's ability to memorize huge word lists simply by looking at them through some kind of photographic memory isn't even enough to pull this off, as impressive as it already is. In addition, you also need to be able to consistently spot every possible move on the board from the jumbled letters during the game. And last but not least, Scrabble is also a complex strategy game, and somehow Nigel is completely unparalleled, not just in the first one of these skills, but in all three of them. So now he's done it again, and of course, generally speaking, it comes down to the same story. Nigel has simply done these three things in yet another language, but there are again so many fascinating aspects to it that I want to tell you the full story. So we had some hints that this might happen. After Nigel's French Revolution, it was of course a logical question what language he might tackle next. You might remember that the Icelandic Scrabble Federation unsuccessfully tried to convince him to try their huge complex language, but I also mentioned in my earlier video that there were rumors about Nigel eyeing Spanish as his next pursuit. Specifically, this tournament broadcast was where I got this from.
Jesse was mentioning that Nigel was thinking of studying and learning the Spanish dictionary and then competing in the Spanish championships.
Yep.
Did he talk about that with you?
That was his next plan. He analyses the languages before he starts learning to work out how easy and accessible learning the entire language will be. Because obviously when anyone wants to learn an entire language in 6 weeks, you go for ease of learning.
In 2023, there were already concrete rumors that he was going to show up in Costa Rica for that year's championship, but that didn't materialize. But then, suddenly, earlier this year, this Facebook post appeared. The end is nigh, the day of judgment is upon us. Nigel will play in Granada. At a world championship that really couldn't have chosen a more ominous motto than "Will you be lost for words?" That foreshadowed quite well how the Scrabble community is feeling after this tournament. And sure enough, there Nigel is, and as usual, his excitement is palpable. So we don't know exactly when Nigel started studying Spanish. As far as I could find out, he was busy for more than a year with that, and in retrospect, it does seem like the widely quoted number that he learned French in just 9 weeks might have been inaccurate. But now the day has come and we know that Nigel has studied all of the words up to a certain length. We don't know what length exactly, but all of the words that are valid in Spanish Scrabble. There's an official list that he simply went through. But what we do know is that he did it once again without learning the actual language, because in Scrabble you are not required at tournaments to know what a word means. So apart from the basics like hola, qué tal, dónde está la biblioteca and so on, apart from that, his conversational Spanish is about as good as that of Sam from Extra.
El perro está en el horno.
In fact, Nigel speaks so little Spanish that he didn't even bother learning the numbers beyond 10. Because this time there was no rule that he had to, unlike in French. And so he simply announced his scores during the games as digits, saying 136 instead of 136. Now, people told me that this is not that unusual actually in the context of Spanish Scrabble, and in English we might also say something like 105 instead of 105. But it really is another level of stubbornness to not even learn the word for 12 and say 1-2 instead. But that's where we're at. And so the championship starts with a duplicate competition. Duplicate, as you may recall from the French video, is a Scrabble variant where the only goal is to identify the top scoring move, not the best strategic move, which is often the difference. So it's a pure word knowledge and play finding skill, and gives you a good idea of a player's command over the lexicon. So with Nigel being able to memorize the entire word list and spotting all the moves on the board, do the others even stand a chance here, or is their perro truly en el horno? Well, they might have a chance, because Nigel did not start flawlessly in French back in 2015. He became unbeatable after a while, but he did make some errors in his first competitions, mostly formalities. So just in case something like this does happen again, who might be able to stop him? Well, here's the ELO rating distribution in the Spanish language world ranking. And first of all, this is a bizarrely flat distribution, unlike what I've seen in any other language. Look at how many people are basically on the same level. We'll get back to that later, but for now let's just note that 2 guys stand out clearly from the rest. And these are Benjamin Olaizola, and as always I apologize for butchering any pronunciations, and Serge Amic from, and I'm not making this up, France. The possibly best player to maybe stop Nigel on his quest to a third language title was once again a Frenchman, who does speak Spanish though. He's impressive in his own right, playing expert level Scrabble in 3 languages, a kind of mini version of Nigel, but he just has to feel cursed that Nigel seems to be following him into every language. French is Serge's native language and he's very successful at tournaments there, but much more so in Spanish, where he's won countless titles, including a World Championship title. And in an interview before the tournament, he was asked about Nigel and said this: "Well, so far people often call me extraterrestrial, but I'll have to give that nickname to Nigel now. He will certainly destroy me." And there's no doubt in my mind that he wins the duplicate competition. But Serge said that not without mentioning that Nigel didn't start perfectly in French. Just putting it out there. But I do have to say that I was not feeling optimistic about the chances of the field against Nigel here, for a simple reason. As good as players as Amic and Olaizola are, there was no denying that the depth of competition Nigel was up against was just not comparable to the French language Scrabble community. There are almost 20,000 worldwide tournament players in French, and we've just seen the Spanish world ranking with less than 5% of that number. And that is reflected in the results from the last duplicate World Championship, where 4 players achieved an accuracy of more than 90%. Each of them is impressive, but you know how many people achieved that in the last French Championships? 177. To make the top 10 in French, you could hardly afford any mistakes at all. And Nigel still achieved this kind of dominance after a while. Because that, of course, doesn't have much to do with the other players' performances when you yourself just don't make any mistakes at all. But the point is that it looked like he would even have some decent room for errors in Spanish if necessary, because there wouldn't be like 20 people pouncing on him with a 99% accuracy. All of which made it all the more shocking when Nigel did not in fact win the duplicate championship. Yeah, the tournament started with a huge surprise, as Nigel only came in 2nd place, behind Luis Picciocchi from Argentina. But here's the great part about it. Even in not winning the tournament, Nigel still made history, because he became the first player ever at a Spanish World Championship to play an individual game at 100% accuracy, playing the top scoring move on every single turn. Nobody had done that before in Spanish at a World Championship. And then he played the second ever perfect game in his next round. So how did he lose the championship in game 1? Well, he made 3 mistakes. In this position, Nigel, just like many competitors, simply blanked on the fact that this move scores a few more points than this one. And yes, AJ looks like a strange 2-letter word to us, but it is valid in Spanish. But Nigel lost about 100 points, so where did the other mistakes come from? Well, none of them were genuine misses on Nigel's part. He saw all the top moves, but in an earlier move, in this one, he saw the correct move, which is this one or this one. Both of them score 44 points, but he mislabeled it. He put the coordinates of the move as D4, which would be here, where the E is on the board. And that confusion probably comes from the fact that Spanish Scrabble flips the coordinates of the board compared to English Scrabble. But a rule is a rule, so that's 0 points instead of 40. But the first mistake was the most baffling one. In this position, on move 3 of the championship, Nigel played neither of the top scoring 60-point moves over here. Instead, he played the word Danya, and it isn't even clear where he played it, but he played it for 20 points or so. And this is nowhere close to the top move, but even more bizarrely, it isn't even a valid word in Spanish. This is a phony, as we like to call invalid words in Scrabble. So when I saw this live, I thought to myself that there had to be something going on here that we didn't know. Some explanation for why Nigel makes such a strange mistake. We've seen strange bugs in Nigel's internal computer before, but with this weird placement, something else has to be going on. But the organizers confirmed in chat that yes, it's very unambiguous that this was the word that he submitted. And it was only more than a week later that we did find out additional context to this, which is that someone in the playing hall had unintentionally been standing in Nigel's view and he couldn't see the letters properly. Of course, they also announced the letters, but Nigel doesn't necessarily understand what they're saying. He raised his arm to ask, but didn't want to make a fuss, and the problem wasn't resolved in time. And when he finally had the correct letters, time was already almost over and he had no chance to find the correct solution. So yeah, all we really learned here was that even Nigel can't play Scrabble correctly when you don't tell him what letters he has, and that whenever it looks like he has made a mistake, there's usually something else going on. But still, what a surprise to start the tournament, and congratulations to Pecciucci for beating Nigel in duplicate, and we'll just ignore the gigantic asterisk behind that result. But while the duplicate competition is a legit World Championship title, it is the less prestigious one of the two. The main event in Spanish is the regular Scrabble variant. 148 people signed up for that event, and here are the top 10 seeds, apart from Nigel. Without Nigel, Olaizola and Emig would be the clear favorites, and they have in fact won the last 3 titles between them, and the winner before that was Pecciucci, who just won the duplicate event. People play each other in a so-called Swiss system where you get paired with people close to you in the standings, and for the most part you meet each opponent only once. In total, 24 rounds are played over 4 days. But before we look at the games and the results, we should quickly talk about the new language that Nigel is tackling here. Scrabble, of course, remains the same game across languages, in principle, but each game has a different flavor due to the features of the letter distribution and the word list. For example, on Wikipedia you can find out that Klingon Scrabble has 10 apostrophe tiles, and that Malagasy, the language of Madagascar, includes 20 A's, but that's not surprising if the people there have names like Andrea Mirado Aro Hasina Andrea Narimanana, commonly known by the nickname Dax. I can see where people gave him a nickname. And Spanish has its own small specialty in terms of the letters, which are these 3 digraphs and this N with a mustache, which I believe is the official linguistic term. But these don't really change the meta of the game. It's just funny to see what should be a 6-letter word played on 4 spaces on the board. But the word list does change the vibe of the game itself. And the Spanish list, first of all, is huge, with about 180,000 words up to 8 letters only, 50% more than in English, French or German, which are all quite similarly sized. For Nigel, this just meant that he had more words to memorize, first of all, especially because he went beyond 8 letters. But for the game, it means that average scores will be higher, especially because the word list includes so many more bingos, words with 7 or 8 letters that you can use to play all your tiles at once, netting you a 50-point bonus when you do that. But at the same time, while the word list is more extensive in that regard, there's a bit of a catch because it is also more uniform than the English list. These are the number of words in the English list that end in a given letter. Obviously the S stands out, but there's at least some words for every letter, even for the Q, because of what a melting pot of languages the English word list is. In Spanish, that is not the case. 90% of words end in just 5 different letters. And we could illustrate this in a number of different ways. This is just an example, but the point is that as a consequence, some of the letters just don't really work well in the game. These are the letters in English Scrabble ranked by their average usefulness in the game as determined by computer analysis. All else being equal, you'd rather draw the flexible S than the cumbersome Q in English, even though the S has a point value of 1 and the Q scores 10 points. It's still the worst letter because it's so inflexible. And every language has these imbalances in Scrabble, and they are welcome, they make the game interesting, but the Spanish distribution is a bit extreme. Most letters are either great or terrible, there's not much in between, and the Q has wandered off into a corner to cry. It's at -22. That's worse than drawing the Q in English combined with the V and W. And it makes sense when you find out that the Q's point value in Spanish is just 5, not even 10, and that there's not a single word in the entire Spanish list that uses the Q without a U. They don't even have QI, which is how the Q gets played like half the time in English. When I let a computer bot play against itself in Spanish a few thousand times, it just gave up and exchanged tiles instead of playing a move in almost 40% of the cases where it had the Q in its rack. And I can only speculate on the consequences of this, but it seemed to me like these factors might help explain why the rating distribution in the tournament ranking is so flat, where 2/3 of the players are within 100 ELO points of each other. The polarized letter distribution that we just saw should inflate the luck factor in the game a bit, because it levels the playing field when everyone is equally at the mercy of the tile gods, more so than in a language with a more balanced distribution. And at the same time, when you draw the good letters, it is relatively easy to play well as a native speaker, because there's such an abundance of bingos to choose from, and many of them are relatively easy to spot because the words tend to follow common patterns. And the word list, to my impression from the outside, I'm not a native speaker, includes more common Spanish vocabulary than the truly bonkers conglomerate of words that is the English list. As soon as you know a regular Spanish verb, for example, you know like 20 different inflections of it as well. So I got the impression that this flat rating curve mostly reflects the fact that people can get to a decent level of play without having to do the same crazy deep dedicated dictionary word study that is absolutely necessary at expert level in English. And in line with that, people told me that the study and analysis tools that we use to improve in English, like Ziziva, Aerolith and Quackle, haven't even been implemented in Spanish. And there's nothing wrong with this somewhat more casual approach, but my point is that I was starting to fear the worst for their chances against the guy who memorizes the entire word list and optimizes the heck out of the gameplay. Especially because the bigger the word list, the bigger Nigel's advantage should be, as the only guy who will actually learn the entire list. On the other hand, what gave me a little bit of hope for them was the polarized luck factor, where bad luck might doom even Nigel more so than it could in English. Maybe. Quizás. Peut-être. Vielleicht. The truth lies on the board, and with that, here's what happened in the tournament. So, let's just remind ourselves that the first round of the World Championship is literally Nigel's first normal tournament game in Spanish. He goes into the World Championship as an unrated player. What happens in the first round? Well, there was an incredible coincidence of the draw. I think this was just a coincidence. I don't think they did this on purpose. Nigel was paired against Luis Picciocchi, of all people, in round 1. The guy who just managed to beat him in duplicate. And I would love to show you this game, but unfortunately there are no records of it. The live broadcast showed the game on table 1, which wasn't this one. But it ended with the wild score of 493 to 413 for Nigel. As we saw earlier, the huge number of bingos in the Spanish word list means that slugfests like this aren't quite as rare as in English, where this would be an incredible scoreline. So this was quite a statement win to start the tournament, and what happened after that is both easy to narrate and difficult to narrate, because when we go through these next results, you will quickly notice a bit of a theme. That theme is called Nigel wins. No matter if he's playing against another former world champion, Enrique Hernandez, or one of the many strong Argentinian players, Nigel started with 8 wins in a row. Until the final boss arrived, Olaizola, the champion from Argentina, and finally, no, just kidding, Nigel wins. And so the theme continues into round 10 and round 11, and with a 600 win against yet another former world champion, 2 rounds later, Nigel meets an interesting opponent in another fellow non-native speaker. Evanthia's native language is Greek, but unlike Nigel, she does in fact speak Spanish as her second language. It didn't help her much though, as Nigel wins this one by 230 points. Another 500 points follow, and in round 16, Nigel even wins the long-anticipated duel of the bored-looking, grey-bearded, bespectacled players, even though his lookalike manages to keep the scoreline closer than most. Nigel's next scores are 559, 514, 591 and 512, and after a full 20 wins in a row now, he finally meets Serge Amique, who had been struggling throughout the tournament and was never really in contention for the top places, which is why Nigel is paired against him only now. And unfortunately, Serge did not have the luck of the draw on his side in their game, and he never really got much of a chance to truly challenge Nigel, and so he became the 10th player in a row to concede 500 points to him. And so, just like that, Nigel clinches the title. He's the new world champion, even though there are still 3 rounds to go. When this happens in Scrabble tournaments, there's often a rule in place that is invoked in this case called Gibsonization, or in this case, I guess, Gibsonization. This rule, named after the late legendary player in North American Scrabble, David Gibson, specifies that when a player clinches a tournament with rounds left to go, they are not paired against the other co-leaders anymore, because their games don't affect the standings anymore, but against people further down the table. And so it should only get easier for Nigel now in theory, and so the 24-0 sweep looked pretty realistic at this point. But then again, like we saw earlier, the rating distribution is really flat, so his next opponents will actually be at quite a similar level, so why wouldn't they able to beat Nigel if everything clicks in a game? His opponent in round 22 didn't manage to do that, but then, to the relief of the entire Spanish-speaking Scrabble world, entered the hero of the day, a player from, of course, Argentina, with the most Spanish-sounding name of all time, Maria Rosario de la Cruz. Their game started with exchanges from both players. We don't know the exact letters here. This game was not broadcast live. But Maria gets the first bingo down, and although Nigel manages to counter that with a bingo of his own, that was not the case anymore when she went on with Apodares and then Cortijo for 107 points, followed by Usillos, not a bingo, but still a nice 69 points, and she's leading by 170 points against Nigel, and that proved to be too much even for him. Although he did get 2 more bingos down in this game, it wasn't even close at the end. Unfortunately, it's not known exactly how the game ended, but Maria went on to win by about 100 points. And I think this photo says everything. How could you not be happy for her? She was quoted in this blog post as saying that she was unhappy at first about playing Nigel because that's not the kind of challenge she was expecting in her position of the table, but that she managed to focus on her game. And she also said, "Good thing that I managed to go to the World Championships, because otherwise, who could have beaten Nigel? I love her already." And honestly, I was relieved that she stopped the sweep, because despite the clear level difference, that would not have reflected fairly on the field as a whole. They deserve to get at least that 1 win on the board for their honor, but still, what a final result. Nigel went on to win game 24 and finished 5 wins ahead of second place. Or in other words, the same distance as between that second place and place 60. Here's another statistic to capture the absurdity of this result. With the game results as they were, they could have given Nigel a 50-point penalty at the end of every game just for being Nigel, and he would still be the world champion. Of course, the victory itself wasn't a huge surprise, but I don't think many people, including myself, expected this kind of dominance. But then again, I guess nobody ever expects the Nigel Inquisition. And the average scorelines reflect this as well. Here are all the players who scored more points in total than their opponents over the tournament, and at the top we have Nigel, who won his games by 79 points on average. No, just kidding. Here's the data with Nigel. He won by 126 on average. I believe that's what they call an outlier. But, sometimes outliers are not an error in the data. Sometimes they reflect reality. So how did Nigel beat 23 out of 24 native speakers, or at least 22 native speakers, and then there's Serge from France and Eva from Greece? Was it just a lucky run maybe? Well, luck did play some role probably. If we look at the most basic measure of luck in Scrabble, the number of blanks drawn, Nigel was actually unlucky over his 15 games on stream, where he drew 14 blanks to his opponent's 16, and in the same games he actually drew the dreaded Q more often than his opponents, 14 times to 10. But for some other letters the picture is reversed. Nigel got the strong Z tile more often, and he drew way more E's than his opponents, and yes, I counted all the E's in his games by hand. But also an aspect of luck in Scrabble that is even more difficult to quantify is what you could call timing, because Nigel was on the brink of losing in more than one game. For example, in this position, his opponent has a few bingos that he can play, and all of these put him in a good position to win, maybe a 70 or 80% chance, but instead he tries to seal the deal and force the issue by playing Loteador, which really sounds like it should be Spanish to me. But of course, Nigel knows better than this native speaker that this isn't a word in the Spanish word list. So he challenges it off the board and is in a great position to win this game as well, which he did in the end. And of course, this is simply a mistake by his opponent, but it was a mistake that didn't need to happen. And there's some luck to when your opponents will play how well. And this was a lucky break for Nigel, and he had a few of these. So if we imagine, let's say, 100 fictitious reruns of this tournament, I do think that Nigel would typically lose maybe 3 games and not just 1. But of course, the bigger explanation for the result is the same as in English and French, which is just the near flawlessness of Nigel's gameplay. And the important thing to understand here that I need to reiterate from my first video because it's just so central to the story is that this doesn't follow from the word knowledge. Yes, it's a big part of the gap that Nigel's opponents missed 25% of their possible bingos and Nigel missed 0, but 6 of his opponents on the broadcast didn't miss any bingos and Nigel still went 6-0 against them. The other part of the gap are the intermediate moves, and these are the most fascinating to me. What I mean are possessions like this one. This is from Nigel's game against Serge Amique, and it's no coincidence that I'm choosing his game against the perhaps best player in the field, because it showcases why Scrabble is so difficult. This is a position in the beginning of the game, and Serge spends 5 minutes on this position. And that has nothing to do with word knowledge. Instead, it is because there's no move that really looks good here. Do you take as many points as possible, but keep pretty bad letters in the process? Do you do the complete opposite and exchange tiles? Because EIRS is a really promising combination for the next move, so you will make up for that scoring sacrifice? Or do you do something in between, like maybe this move for 7 points or this one for 8, which is a compromise? You score a few points but you keep the E. And what do all these moves do to the board position? All of these approaches seem okay but not great, but unfortunately that doesn't mean that it doesn't matter which one you choose. They are stylistically very different, and choosing the wrong one can easily be a mistake. And that makes these positions so easy to misplay. Players differ in their approach to these positions. Some try to calculate their way through everything logically. Others rely more on their intuition, but regardless, the end result will often be an educated guess. Being an expert player simply means that your educated guesses in these positions are better than other players, but not that they ever stop being guesses entirely. And so it's completely unremarkable that Serge, in this particular case, happens to make a slight mistake. This move that we see on the board, which he played, happens to lose like 3% of win percentage, according to the engine, because apparently exchanging would have been a little bit better. So when I went through all of the important moves, check the footnote for details, in Nigel's 15 broadcast games in this tournament, I was not surprised at all to find out that Nigel's opponents made some kind of error, which I defined as losing at least 3% of win percentage, according to the engine, on about 40% of the moves. Yes, this is not quite the standard you would see at the top level in English, but it is decent. It represents an intermediate level of play that in itself is already really difficult to reach. But how about Nigel? Well, of course, I knew from the English and French language games already that he plays very precisely and hardly makes any mistakes at all, but I've never seen any actual numbers for that, at least on middle game positions. And you also have to imagine that there has to be some collateral damage to playing in a different language, right? Even Nigel has to be guessing to some degree in these positions, right? And I guess I really should have known better. But hey, there is some hope for humanity. Let's look at the 2 mistakes that Nigel made. Well, it turns out they weren't actually mistakes. They turned out to be both very similar positions actually, so it's enough to look at one. Towards the end of a game where he is in the lead, Nigel sacrifices quite a few points to play these defensive moves, blocking the most dangerous area of the board and making sure his opponent can't play bingo to come back into this game. This is a common enough tactic, it makes total sense, but the engine thinks that it isn't quite correct. But as always, when you think Nigel has made a mistake, there's a catch. And that is that I analyzed all of these moves on a low depth in the engine, not looking very far ahead into the future, because deeper analysis would take much longer, and this whole thing already took quite long. And in most cases in Scrabble, a low depth analysis gives you very precise results already, because you can't plan very far ahead in this game anyway. But there are moves with a long-term goal, such as this one, blocking the most dangerous areas of the board so that no win is possible anymore. So just out of interest, let's see if analyzing this on a higher depth makes any difference at all in this instance. Oh yeah, sure, Nigel is correct after all. And the same is true for the other alleged mistakes, so the actual verdict is that Nigel made no mistakes in 93 moves. And that's the point where I quedo myself sin palabras. It reminds me of the way football commentators at some point clearly started running out of metaphors to describe Lionel Messi's similar way of making the ridiculous look easy, with my favorite attempt by football commentator Ray Hudson being, "It's like playing poker against a witch." And the beautiful paradox about this is that the vast majority of those 93 precise moves aren't even mind-blowing or mysterious in any way. Expert players can look at them and think, yeah, I could have found that as well. We'll look at Nigel's spectacular moves, of which he did have a few at this tournament as well. But most of the moves individually hardly even look difficult for expert players. They should all be findable, but that's the same effect that makes people watching at home think that they would crush it at Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. It's so much more difficult when you're actually the one in the spotlight. The only way to really feel how difficult this is might be to play in a Scrabble tournament yourself and analyze your games afterwards with the engine. Every time I do that, I feel like Scrabble as a game exists only to remind me of what an idiot I am. The engine is merciless and you cannot avoid making avoidable mistakes in this game, unless you're Nigel. Which is why when Nigel plays against the aforementioned second best player in the world, David Eldar, after the game asks the commentator in seriousness if he's missed anything, and Nigel asks it as a joke.
Anything else to say?
Did I miss anything? Thank you.
Did I miss it?
Yes.
Cool, what did I miss? Tatterized.
You should look at.
There's only 4 points more.
Yeah. and
Tartarized?
Tartarized.
Where'd that play?
Oh, through the AR.
Oh, sick. I think I even know that. What a guy.
What a guy.
Doesn't even want the fame.
So to see what this looks like on the board, let's go through what I think was Nigel's most beautiful game played in this tournament. It's the game against the already mentioned native speaker of Greek, Evantia Tsalapati. And Nigel starts this game with a lucky draw. After she correctly exchanges on her opening rack, he plays Citases as his opening bingo, and this would be an easy bingo for native speakers as well, so that's just luck. And after correctly playing Terror on his next move, Nigel draws lucky again, but this is already an example where people should be able to find the top move, but might often not find it. There are a lot of normal bingos that Nigel can play here, but only one of them forms this beautiful overlap and thereby scores the maximum amount of points. And on the next move, Nigel gets a different kind of tricky move, which is this one. Nigel could play the Z here for one of these moves, scoring more than 50 points, but it might be better to save it and play Ahueco for just 42 instead, sacrificing a lot of points, but this is also a more defensive play, and the question is if this is worth sacrificing this many points. Now the engine here doesn't agree at first glance, as you can see in the top left corner here. The rough evaluation by the engine puts the Z moves on top, so this is not just Nigel following some basic rules of thumb, but when you let the engine actually analyze the move in depth, it agrees with Nigel's choice of sacrificing points here, and he's rewarded royally for it. On the next move he can cash in on the Z, and then he draws a bingo from it. But again, this is lucky, but native speakers would probably play something like pareceis here, because the verb sarkear is not common at all. It's not a common word, people might not know it. So that's 110 points for Nigel, or as he would say, 1-1-0. But then Nigel finally runs out of luck on his next move, drawing the Q and some bad letters with it. But even on this move, there's an edge to be gained that not every player would have gained in Nigel's place here. Because he is forced to exchange tiles, but he avoids making the easy mistake of following standard protocol here. You can see that the engine's immediate top move would be to exchange GLQX and keep AEN, but Nigel correctly decides to keep the X because there's already a juicy spot for it on the board, which Nigel promptly cashes in on the next move. Usually you would not keep the X. It's way down here on the list of suggested moves, keeping the X, because it usually doesn't help you much, and Nigel recognizes the spot. Again, other players can recognize this as well, but it's so easy to just blank on it and do what you would always do and just exchange the X. And so this is the kind of move that looks lucky, but isn't. On the next move, Nigel draws the G again, which isn't great, and the puzzle here is not a spectacular move, nothing very high scoring, but it's again easy to miss because you need to have the board vision not to overlook this sneaky little spot for the G, where you can play the best move available on the board. Nigel's next move is just pure word knowledge flexing again, playing Mbicha for 55 points. He has redrawn the Q though, and on the next move he can get rid of it. He has a few moves to do that, and among the similar options that get rid of the Q, he chooses what the engine thinks is the best move. Of course he does. So I have glossed over Eva's moves here because it really isn't necessary to put her on the spot directly, but of course she didn't do the same as Nigel here. She didn't play a flawless game, and in fact she made all the different kinds of mistakes that we talked about. Missing a bingo, misevaluating a situation, missing the best out of a bunch of mediocre moves, and that simply tilts the chances in Nigel's favor and would maybe have led to a 100-point win under average circumstances, and with the good luck that Nigel had in this game, becomes a 200-point win. But we are not at the end of the game yet, and here comes the other reason why I wanted to show this one in particular. First of all, Nigel plays this move when one tile is left in the bag, and I would love to explain this move to you, but I can't even try really. More on that in the footnote. But now we are in an endgame position, so both players know which other tiles the opponent has on their rack, because they can track the tiles and see which ones haven't been played yet. So Eva knows that Nigel has ADDEIO, and Nigel in turn knows that she has GLLNOPU. And she plays one of these sensible looking moves in this position. There isn't much left to go for here, and the game has long been decided. Just play a reasonable move for 16 points. That's what most players would do, but not Nigel. Nigel now looks at this position in a language he doesn't speak, in the game that he's won by 200 points already, and within less than a minute doesn't play one of the boring, perfectly fine looking moves for 14 to 22 points, and instead goes full Homer Simpson mode. Nigel plays do for 3 points, because that is objectively the correct solution to this position. And as so often, the reason is obvious in retrospect for expert players, but only in retrospect. The simple reason is that even though the L in Spanish makes 5 different 2-letter words, al, el, la, le, and lo, there is, by what is almost a freak of nature, not a single A, E, or O on this board that would allow Eva to play of the 2 L's that she still has on her rack. She's stuck. Now, the basic idea of sticking your opponent on a letter, to a letter, with a letter, I hate English prepositions, upon a letter, is a standard tactic, but you think of that tactic when your opponent has a clunky letter like the Q, not a completely normal one like the L. So no wonder that Eva didn't realize that this was even a danger, leading her to play Pongo instead of Logo or something, or Longo. And Nigel not only finds this counterintuitive solution in a situation where he really doesn't need to because the game is long decided, he also figures out within 56 seconds that it is in fact the optimal sequence of play. Even though his move actually doesn't prevent her from playing one L, but she now has to use the U to do that, and as a result has no moves left at all. If she still had the U, she could at least play that on the next move. So all she can do, which is the reason why Nigel blocked the O, she could have played low to that O, but like this, she has to use the L and the U at the same time, and in fact it would have been optimal for her just to play the U here for 11 points and keep both Ls. But that's how difficult endgames are. So all she can do now, because she can't play the Ls, is to pass her turn repeatedly as Nigel, slowly but surely, grabs as many points as possible, one move after the other. And his last move gives her an O to play an L, but now the game is over. And again, he's doing this in a language that he speaks so badly that instead of telling his opponents what letter a blank was supposed to stand for, he pointed it out on the board to avoid misunderstandings. But all of these are the reasons why, in the end, it was no contest. And going 23-1 against this field translates to an ELO rating of 2700, 350 points ahead of Olajuwon. I don't think this is quite accurate because, like I said, I don't think 23-1 will be his average performance against this field. Probably a rating in the 2500s, 2600s is more realistic. As it was, Picciocchi and Olajuwon took the silver and bronze medals, or as this blog post put it, completed the podium as the first human players. And in recapping all of this, I think it's worth emphasizing again the point that this article about Nigel in the aftermath of the tournament also describes, which is that in addition to people admiring his gameplay, Nigel is also liked for being very, very modest about this. And my general impression is that he really doesn't get what all the fuss is about. The article here echoes what other players are saying about Nigel, that although he doesn't approach people to talk to them, he is friendly to anyone who does, and is so stoic about winning or losing that he didn't even find out the result of the duplicate competition until someone told him the next day. It's not a coincidence that even within the Scrabble community, where this guy has been dominating tournaments for more than 2 decades now, a huge majority of people is still cheering for him. Usually people cheer for the underdogs, right? And it really says a lot about a person when they are a beloved perennial favorite. And nothing reflects that better than the fact that when the prize ceremony at the World Championship was running late, Nigel was like, "I'm too old for this mierda," and left, apparently. He missed his own prize ceremony, although arguably the prize ceremony missed him. Nothing at all except for a typical, "well, I was just a bit lucky" quote from Nigel is known in terms of how he reacted to winning the World Championship. But if the past is any indication, we have to assume that all of you watching this care more about it than he does himself. And although we don't have an interview from this championship, I have to mention that after finishing my video on French Nigel, I found out that there is actually a genuine interview with Nigel on YouTube, although it's predictably monosyllabic. I only found this out so late, despite thorough research, because apparently the uploader didn't feel like putting any indication in the title. I guess if they ever caught the Loch Ness Monster on camera, they'd call it "My Trip to the Lake" or something. But anyway, the interviewer asked Nigel what his tips were for improving in Scrabble, and I think the answer tells you all you need to know about Nigel as a person.
And would you have any tips for us as novice or beginner Scrabble players on how we could improve or raise our games?
To improve, well, you need to learn the words, but the most important thing is to enjoy yourself.
So what's next for Nigel now? Well, if he should be looking for another challenge in the future, the question won't so much be what other languages could be interesting. For example, I saw a lot of comments on Will Anderson's videos saying that Nigel should do something even more exotic and learn a language with a different alphabet, such as Arabic. The practical question really is what other languages even have Scrabble communities. There simply are no tournaments in Portuguese, for example, and only a few of them in Italian. And for that reason, the obvious answer at this point is probably my own language, German. We don't have a worldwide community, but we do have an active tournament scene, probably at a similar level of gameplay as the Spanish scene, maybe a bit worse. So, in other words, we wouldn't stand a chance, but as much as it would hurt my own chances of ever winning championships again, I'm too much of a fan not to root for Nigel actually doing that. So, in case Nigel somehow sees this, let me just point out that Germany has some really nice regions for going on bike tours, which is Nigel's other passion except for Scrabble. And also that you would be able to play your own name in our lexicon. This is apparently an obscure Austrian dialect word for a small person, pronounced Nigel. Polish could be interesting as well. They have a nice tournament scene and of course a truly exotic language, including the strangest 2-letter word ever, Y, which is also my reaction to that word. The Czech language is also an option, and of course there's always Icelandic. But in terms of magnitude of the competition, German Scrabble would be the logical next stop. We have a word list ready to be memorized. We have a national championship that is technically a world championship, but of course usually mostly people from Germany compete and a few from Austria and Switzerland. We are the perfect next victims. So if after Monsieur Richards and Senor Ricardo we will ever get to meet Herrn Richard, I'll be sure to make another video then of my own futile attempt to stop Nigel. But for now, check out the links in the video description if you want to find out more about Tournament Scrabble and maybe join our community. No matter if you're a total beginner or at any other level, we're generally very welcoming. But I want to leave you with our protagonist's own words, because something else I found while researching this, and I swear this is real, is an entry from Nigel to a contest by the New Zealand Scrabble Association's quarterly magazine in 1998, asking its readers for haikus about the game. They had this nice entry, they had another one starting with the telling line, "Help, first game Nigel," and they had an entry by Nigel that went like this. And I'm not here to criticize your poetry, Nigel, but I have to say, coming from you, that last line is rich. Gracias for watching, everyone. See you next time.